everyone, and welcome to your top human rights organization review. I am your host, Bryce Dolan. Today we're going to look at several of the top 10 international human rights organizations, and we're going to cover several topics. Now, first we're going to begin with Amnesty International. They posted an article, a video, and a virtual tour that I encourage you to take a look at, focusing on the horrors of Syria prisons. Then we'll move on to Indonesia and Human Rights Watch as Indonesia courts review anti-LGBT laws. And then staying on the topic of LGBT, Protection International says the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, the IACHR, welcomes progress on human rights of LGBT persons. Now, going back to Human Rights Watch, we check in on the whereabouts of a Burundian journalist who disappeared 1 month ago now, and then we will end the video with Refugees International and the vicious attacks on humanitarians in South Sudan. Now, to begin, Amnesty International is calling to an end of the horror in Syria's torture prison. This article contains a video and virtual tour to give you a first-hand experience as a reader of what these prisoners have and are experiencing. Now, this issue is so disturbing and needs attention, we are making it today's hashtag. Hashtag Stop Syrian Torture. Now, since 2011, thousands of people have died while being detained in Syria's brutal detention centers. Tens of thousands of more refugees have experienced shocking torture. Now, people are dying from starvation. And they're not just dying from starvation, they're dying from denial of basic healthcare needs. Something as simple as an infected cut, an ingrown fingernail is causing these people to die. Now, many have been beaten, raped, and electrocuted, along with other forms of torture to extract these forced confessions, essentially. Now, they created this virtual tour and these sounds and the sights of this prison from former prisoners who described endless cycles of beatings with plastic hoses, silicone pipes, and wooden sticks. Some were forced to even stand in water as they were administered electrical shocks. Now, anyone suspected of opposing the Syrian government is at risk getting put into these prisons. Labor business people, students, lawyers, doctors, bloggers, university professors, journalists, people helping their neighbors, or activists even standing up for minorities. All these people have been taken to these torture prisons. Now, people are being locked up for just helping their neighbors. Lawyers and doctors and journalists have been arrested for just doing their jobs. That's a crime against humanity. But still, the Syrian security forces get away with it. Now, as the world attempts to resolve this ongoing conflict, justice for people in the detention centers must be a priority if Syrians are to have any trust in a lasting peace. Now, Russia and the USA have considerable influence over negotiations, partly because of their military involvement in the region. But together, we must end the horror in Syria's prisons. As a crucial first step, the Syrian government must let in independent monitors to investigate the brutal detention centers now. But moving on to Human Rights Watch. We touched on this a little bit before in an earlier segment about Indonesia's stance on LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex persons on their rights. Well, more recently, the Indonesian courts are to review the anti-LGBTI laws. Indonesia's Constitutional Court will hold its fifth hearing on August 23, 2016, on proposed revision of the country's criminal code that would punish consensual same-sex behavior and increase penalties for sexual activity out of wedlock, Human Rights Watch says. Now, the proposed legislation, which carries penalties up to 5 years in prison, violates the internationally protected rights of privacy and non-discrimination. Now, Human Rights Watch said that the court is being asked to rule on the constitutionality of proposed changes to the criminal code brought by petitioners led by professors from the Bogor Agricultural Institute near Jakarta. Now, they are seeking amendments to laws on adultery, rape, and sex with a minor in Indonesia's criminal code. Now, the proposed criminal sanctions before the Constitutional Court are not only a threat to LGBTI people, but to all Indonesians, says Grame Reed, LGBTI rights director at Human Rights Watch. Now, he also was quoted saying, laws that threaten privacy inevitably affect everyone. Now, that's a pretty good point. The proposed amendment follows on an unprecedented anti-LGBT campaign that began in January with a series of biased and false statements about lesbians, gay, bisexual, and transgender people from government officials and politicians. Now, the anti-LGBTI onslaught provided social sanction for harassment and violence against this LGBTI Indonesian community. And they also were receiving death threats by militant Islamists. Now, government institutions, including the National Broadcast Commission and the National Child Protection Commission, issued censorship directives banning information and broadcasts that portrayed the lives of LGBTI people as normal, as well as so-called propaganda about LGBTI lives. Now, that combination of discriminatory rhetoric and policy decisions harm the privacy, security, and free expression rights of people across the country. Privacy rights are a fundamental protection that underlie everyone's physical autonomy and preferred identity, Human Rights Watch said. Now, Grame Reed, the director of LGBTI rights for Human Rights Watch, was quoted saying, "The Constitutional Court has an important opportunity to strengthen the right to privacy and non-discrimination in Indonesia. At stake in the proposed laws are the privacy rights of all Indonesians, the bedrock of a society in which individual dignity is protected for everyone." Now, staying on the topic of LGBT rights, Protection International says the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the IACHR, has issued a press release welcoming the laws and measures approved by the United States and several states of Latin America, while encouraging them to continue their efforts to ensure the human rights of LGBTI persons. Now, in the past few months, countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Peru, the United States, and Uruguay have passed legislations with regards for the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex persons. Now, among these positive changes, Ecuador approved the Organic Law of Identity and Civil Data Management, allowing individuals over 18 to change their name on their ID as well as their gender instead of the sex. Now, similarly, the Gender Identity Law was enacted in Bolivia, and the Human Rights Commission of the Chilean Senate approved changes to a gender identity bill, giving the authority to the Civil Registry Service to amend the identification documents of trans adults. This full press release is available on this link, and all the links will be provided in the description below the video. This is a huge step for LGBTI rights. A great article to read and actually come out after we touched on what's going on in Indonesia with the LGBTI community down there. So this is a great article and press release stating of all the positive things that's happening for the LGBTI community. Now, moving on, it has been a month now since the disappearance of a Burundian journalist, Jean Bigirimana. He vanished after leaving his home in Burundi's capital, Bujumbura, for Bugarama, a town about 40 kilometers away. Now, there are unconfirmed reports that he was arrested by members of the intelligence services, but his whereabouts remain unknown. Now, as days went by, Jean's family, friends, and co-workers at Uwaku newspaper began to believe him to be dead. These cases are not uncommon, and unfortunately, a lot of them end with no knowledge of the victim's fate, and as a result, no possibility of closure. Now, the government remained silent on his disappearance until the Uwaku newspaper launched a campaign to find Jean. Now, police spokesperson Pierre Nkuri Kayai, after 3 days into the missing persons case, flatly denied security forces had arrested Jean. Now, a week later, the president's communication advisor tweeted that the government was investigating and was deeply concerned. Now, he implied the opposition might be involved, and he said he feared the worst. Then just a few weeks ago, August 5th, a dead body was found in the Mumbarazi River in Rumeva, the same province he'd been heading to when he disappeared. Now, there was speculation that it might be Jean's, and an intrepid team of Iwaku journalists went to the scene to investigate. Police, judicial, and intelligence officers joined them, but found nothing. Now, on August 7th, the journalists returned alone and discovered a dead body in an inaccessible part of the river. 2 days later, a second corpse was found in the river, while media reported that a third was discovered in neighboring Jintega province. Now, the two bodies were eventually fished out of the Mumbarazi River, but were badly decomposed. One had been decapitated, the other had been weighed down by stones. Now, the authorities made no further attempt to identify the victims or establish how they died. There was no autopsies, no DNA tests. Police simply announced that Jean was not among the two dead, and last week, local officials buried the bodies. Is that the end of the story? No. Jean's family has the right to an investigation to determine what happened and if a crime actually took place, to see those responsible prosecuted, and as do the families of the two victims, whoever they are, of the dead bodies that they found in the river. Now, the Burundian authorities should launch thorough, independent investigations, if necessary, calling on outside medical or scientific expertise. Jean Bugirimana is not the only person to have been abducted or disappeared in Burundi in the past year. Let us not forget the human rights activist Marie-Claudette Kwizera from the Burundian group Ligue Iteka, who was taken away by a vehicle thought to belong to the intelligence services last December. Now, nor the scores of other Burundians who have disappeared or gone missing or been found dead with barely any reaction by the government. All of these families have a right to full investigations, full, independent, and speedy investigations into what happened to their relatives. It is high time the authorities ensure that this happens. It doesn't take a genius to sit here and read this article and look at that situation and clearly think that there is something going on here. They find two more dead bodies in a river. One's nearly decapitated, one's weighed down with stones, and you don't want to figure out why those bodies are there or who those bodies belong to? Something doesn't seem right. But moving on. We're going to end the show with Refugees International. Humanitarians are facing vicious attacks in South Sudan. Now, we touched on this a little bit after the fighting broke out in Juba, talked about how the soldiers went and started raping and killing in nearby safe havens for refugees, essentially, where humanitarian workers were working and humanitarian workers have been targeted. Well, it has pretty much turned into a daily occurrence. In an earlier segment, like I said, we talked about how it just happened to this one encampment. Well, humanitarian workers, foreigners, and Americans in particular are being targeted in South Sudan. In recent years, humanitarian workers, aid workers, and foreigners have been specific targets for these occurrences, so much that aid and humanitarian organizations are beginning to think about cutting the aid to South Sudan. During its independence struggle, South Sudan was kept afloat by enormous quantities of foreign assistance. And even as other foreign policy priorities came and went, aid to South Sudan kept flowing because of the international community's goodwill. Well, this aid was not always effective, as many observers have pointed out, yet it was certainly guided by a genuine, strong desire to see South Sudanese succeed. Today, however, with the crisis in South Sudan escalating, the world's optimism has faded. A peace deal between President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar lies in tatters. Violence against civilians continues at a horrifying clip and is spreading into parts of the country that had enjoyed relative calm. And now the nation's economy seems to hit new lows with each passing month, crushed by a collapse in the oil revenue and massive corruption. Now, the humanitarian situation remains dire, with more than 1.6 million internally displaced and 74,000 forced to seek refuge in neighboring countries. Just this week, President Kiir himself veered close to inciting violence against foreigners when he told a gathering of South Sudanese politicians, now these whites are saying they want to bring a protection force. To protect who? For us. We don't do anything bad to anybody, but if somebody has interfered into our right, I don't think we will allow them to go without us touching them. The government's rhetoric is being met with actions on the ground, not just against diplomats, but also against humanitarian personnel, both foreigners and local. In 2015, more attacks on humanitarians were reported in South Sudan than any other country. And during the recent violence in Juba, humanitarians told Refugees International of repeated physical abuse and robbery at checkpoints run by the South Sudanese security forces. Now, during multiple stops, soldiers specifically asked whether any of the passengers were Americans. Now, if these attacks continue, aid agencies will surely limit or suspend their operations in South Sudan. Others will spend more on security and less on assistance in order to protect their personnel. Now, you can find this article, along with the other articles we talked about earlier, in the description below. Their links are included. Feel free to visit each of those websites. Those are great organizations. But that does it for me, ladies and gentlemen, and your top human rights organization review. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a like on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. But until next time, I'll see you around.